How does a high society photographer, a man whose reputation was built on capturing the fading elegance of Bavarian royals, become the chief architect and visual gatekeeper for a dictator's image? This was Heinrich Hoffmann before he ever met Adolf Hitler. And the transformation reveals as much about Hoffmann's character as it does about the era. In the rarefied, sepia-toned, and almost melancholic air of pre-war Munich, a city clinging to its artistic and aristocratic past as the capital of Kunst and beer, Hoffmann was a man of established, thoroughly conventional success. His studio on the fashionable Schellingstrasse was a fixture of polite bourgeois society. His lens was focused almost exclusively on the polished, mannered, and often staid world of the fading Wittelsbach dynasty. He was a master of the formal portrait, employing sophisticated, Rembrandtesque lighting and classic respectful compositions to capture the veneer of nobility, the rustle of silk, the glint of a monocle and the stiff propriety of an empire on the very brink of dissolution. His subjects were dukes, princesses, wealthy industrialists, university professors, and seasoned artists. His world was one of tradition, status, and the quiet, ordered elegance of an age that was about to be obliterated by the canons of the great war and the subsequent hyperinflationary chaos of the Weimar Republic. He was not, by any stretch of the imagination, an ideologue, a fanatic, or a political radical. He was, by all contemporary accounts, a jovial, pragmatic, and somewhat portly businessman, a Bavarian Catholic who enjoyed the good life, a fine cigar, good food, and the considerable respectability his trade afforded him. His camera chronicled the last gasps of an old, romantic world, capturing portraits of men and women who were blissfully, tragically unaware of the abyss awaiting them. This foundation is critical to understanding the man. He was not a product of the Nazi ideology from its inception, but rather a consummate opportunist with an invaluable high-demand skill, a man whose keen eye for aesthetics and, more importantly, for financial opportunity would lead him from the plush, velvet-draped parlors of royalty to the dark, beating heart of the Third Reich. He was perfectly positioned, an insider to the old world, yet entirely unencumbered by its loyalties, ready and waiting to document, shape, and ultimately profit from the rise of the new. If you find this complex, unsettling, and critically important journey into the dark lens of propaganda and the mechanisms of absolute power compelling, we sincerely ask you to please consider supporting our work. This historical analysis is the product of extensive, painstaking research sourced from academic texts, historical archives, and primary source documents. Your engagement is the vital engine, the literal lifeblood, that makes these deep, time-consuming dives possible. We ask you to take just 1 second to press the like button, as it truly and significantly helps our channel's visibility within the algorithm. It's allowing us to reach a wider, more engaged audience. If you haven't already, please subscribe to our channel and, crucially, click that notification bell so you never miss a new investigation into these critical and often overlooked stories that have shaped our modern world. And finally, if you know someone, a student, a colleague, a friend who is interested in history, the psychology of power, the role of media in society, or art history, please share this video with them. Your support is the fuel that allows us to combat misinformation and keep uncovering the past. Presenting it in this detailed, unflinching format, in 1920, Hoffmann made a fateful career move, one that his bourgeois colleagues would have seen as bizarre, even degrading. He joined the obscure German Workers' Party. Soon after, he met its magnetic, frenetic speaker Adolf Hitler, and took one of the first professional photographs of the future dictator. This decision, seemingly minor, almost whimsical at the time, was the absolute, unalterable pivot on which his entire life and fortune would turn. Munich in 1920 was not the genteel city of his royal portraits. It was a seething, violent cauldron of post-war chaos, national humiliation, and extremist political fermentation. It was a city of street brawls, political assassinations, and crippling economic collapse, where heavily armed Freikorps units clashed with communist revolutionaries in the shadows of its grandest monuments. Hundreds of tiny, fractured, and ephemeral parties vied for attention in the smoky, desperate, and rumor-filled atmosphere of the city's cavernous beer halls. For Hoffmann, a man with bourgeois sensibilities and established connections to the old establishment, to join the ragtag Deutsche Arbeiterpartei DAP, party number 55, was an incredible gamble. It was a significant step down from photographing royalty. It was deliberately stepping into the sawdust, the spilled beer, the smell of stale tobacco, and the brawl of street-level politics. But Hoffmann, ever the opportunist with a nose for the next big thing, sensed something that others missed. He heard the raw, hypnotic, and primal energy of the party's new propaganda chief, Adolf Hitler, a man who could enrapture a hostile crowd. He saw not a polished statesman, but a subject of immense raw and untapped visual potential. That first photograph, likely taken in a crowded hall or a makeshift studio, was more than a simple snapshot. It was a transition. It was the very first time Hitler, the awkward, passionate agitator, was captured not by an amateur follower, but by a professional, high-society image maker. It marked the beginning of the conscious construction of the Hitler image. The moment the man who chronicled kings first pointed his lens at the man who would systematically destroy them, and in doing so, secured his own extraordinarily lucrative future. Hoffmann didn't just take photos. He built a relationship, a fortress of trust, brick by brick. By showing an unwavering, almost sycophantic, dog-like loyalty and providing an intimate, indispensable service no one else could, he strategically maneuvered himself into being the only person allowed to photograph Hitler, gaining unparalleled and eventually legally mandated exclusive access. This was his true, unadulterated genius, a masterpiece of social engineering, psychological flattery, and commercial savvy. Far more than pure photographic art. In the early 1920s, Hitler was notoriously awkward, tensely private, and deeply distrustful of the press, which he saw as controlled by his Jewish Bolshevik enemies. He was acutely conscious of his provincial image and his past failures. He despised intellectuals and academics, but felt comfortable around craftsmen, fellow artists, and unpretentious doers. Hoffmann, with his jovial Bavarian demeanor, his non-threatening, political shop talk about cameras and art, and his shared passion for architecture and painting, was the perfect foil. He wasn't a journalist asking prying questions. He was a Dienstleister, a simple service provider, who only wanted to make his subject look good. He made himself indispensable. He would wait for hours at the Brown House, camera ready, never complaining, always available, always cheerful. Most importantly, he gave Hitler absolute veto power over every single image, a crucial, brilliant act of deference that built profound trust. Hitler, pathologically obsessed with his own image, would personally review the contact sheets, often with a magnifying glass, destroying any negatives he felt made him look undignified, weak, or ridiculous. This unwavering loyalty was a calculated investment. In return, Hitler granted him exclusivity. No other photographer was permitted. This monopoly, this sole right, transformed Hoffmann from a mere photographer into the visual gatekeeper of the Reich, the sole purveyor of the Führer's likeness, and the chief architect of his public persona. Hoffmann's propaganda genius was most evident in his photo book, The Hitler Nobody Knows Hitler, V. in Kiener Kent. It bypassed politics entirely, showing a human Hitler, a simple man smiling with children, relaxing at home, and playing with his dog, crafting a benign, fatherly, almost neighborly public persona. Published in 1932, it's just on the cusp of Hitler's seizure of power and in the midst of brutal election campaigns that painted him as a dangerous extremist. This book was an insidious masterstroke of political branding. It was a direct, calculated, and devastatingly effective counter-narrative to the image of the dangerous demagogue, the rabid anti-Semite, and the beer hall brawler that his political opponents and the foreign press correctly painted. Hoffmann's lens performed a deliberate act of political domestication. It was propaganda of the soft focus, an appeal to the sentiment and the Volkisch ideals of the German people, particularly the conservative. middle class and women who yearned for a strong but benevolent leader in the mold of a Hindenburg. Hoffmann's book presented a direct alternative. Here was Hitler, not screaming at a rally, but in a simple white shirt, tireless offering flowers to a woman. Here he was, patting the head of a blonde, Aryan-looking child. It's a very picture of the benign Uncle Adolf. Here he was at his Berghof retreat, gazing thoughtfully at the majestic mountains, a man of nature or playing fetch with his beloved German shepherd, Blondie. The book was a commercial blockbuster, selling hundreds of thousands of copies. It brilliantly bypassed the intellect, the political debates, and the economic arguments, and aimed straight for the heart. It presented the architect of a violent, hateful ideology as a man of simple, humble tastes, a friend to animals, and a gentle protector of children. It was a complete, curated fabrication, and it was essential in making a monster palatable to the masses. Perhaps Hoffmann's most revealing work, a series that unmasks the entire artifice, was a set of photos Hitler explicitly ordered destroyed, taken around 1925. They show Hitler frantically practicing his hand gestures and dramatic poses for upcoming speeches, revealing the calculated, insecure, and intensely theatrical construction of the Führer persona. These images are the raw, embarrassing, and illuminating making of footage. The complete antithesis of the curated, relaxed Hitler nobody knows. In the privacy of Hoffmann's studio, Hitler, then still a rising but insecure politician, recently released from Landsberg prison for his failed beer hall putsch, demanded a feedback session. He was in the process of rebranding himself from a failed revolutionary to a legitimate political figure, and he knew his oratory was key. "Show me what I look like," he effectively asked. "Am I convincing?" What Hoffmann captured was not a natural-born messianic leader, but a performer meticulously, almost desperately rehearsing his part. The photos show Hitler in a suit and tie, gesticulating wildly to an empty room. His face contorted in a range of studied expressions: messianic rage, intense supplication, resolute command, and wide-eyed fervor. He practices the clenched fist for power, the pointed finger for accusation, the open palm plea for unity, and the Sprechbiss, or speech pose, searching for the most effective physical language to channel his ideology. He would pose, Hoffmann would click, and Hitler would reportedly study the contact sheets with the intense, critical scrutiny of a silent film actor reviewing his screen test. Is this powerful? Is this convincing? Is this too ridiculous? The images reveal the deep-seated insecurity of the man, but also the meticulous, conscious, and almost desperate construction of the public-facing Führer. He was not a natural, he was studied. Hitler's subsequent order to destroy these negatives shows his deep-seated desire to protect the illusion. The Führer was to be seen as an organic force of nature, not a rehearsed actor. Hoffmann, by saving them, preserved the evidence of the fraud. Hoffmann's company then weaponized this unparalleled access, mass-producing his portraits on millions upon millions of postcards, posters, calendars, cigarette cards, and most crucially, postage stamps. His work ensured Hitler's face was the most dominant, ubiquitous, and inescapable visual in all of Germany, solidifying the cult of personality on an industrial, totalitarian scale. With his exclusive monopoly legally secured by Hitler himself, Hoffmann's studio, Heinrich Hoffmann, Verlag National Sozialistischer Bilder publishing house of National Socialist images, became a vast and wealthy propaganda empire. This was the industrial-scale monetization and distribution of the Führer's image. The postcard was the key initial vector. It was cheap, accessible, and personal. A German citizen could buy a postcard of the Führer with children, or the Führer as statesman, place it in their own home, or mail it, creating a personal pseudo-familial bond with the leader. But the postage stamp, beginning in 1937, was the true stroke of totalitarian brilliance. Hoffmann's portrait of Hitler became the standard issue stamp for the entire Reich. This meant that every letter, every bill, every package, every piece of personal or business communication sent within Germany or its expanding occupied territories had to carry Hitler's face. It was a daily, unavoidable, state-mandated interaction with the leader's image. It was a form of forced intimacy, requiring citizens to buy, lick, and affix the dictator's likeness to their most personal correspondence. Hoffmann's photography was no longer just documentation. It was the mechanism for the total saturation of the German visual field. Hitler was omnipresent. his gaze inescapable. From the post office to the private living room, and Hoffmann owned the copyright to that omnipresence. Hoffmann's role extended deep into Hitler's private life, far beyond the camera, embedding him into the fabric of the dictator's personal world. In 1929, it was in Hoffmann's bustling Munich studio on Amalienstraße that Hitler, then 40, first met a 17-year-old studio assistant, a young, athletic, and largely apolitical woman named Eva Braun. This single, seemingly random introduction forever linked Hoffmann to the absolute center of Hitler's hidden private world. Hoffmann's studio was a successful commercial enterprise, and he employed several young women as assistants and clerks. One of them was Eva, a recent graduate of a convent school, was tasked with running errands, processing film, and selling photos. One evening, Hitler, whom Braun only knew by his party nickname Herrwolf, was visiting Hoffmann to look at photos. The photographer, in his role as the genial host, introduced his young employee, making a casual, flirtatious remark. A flirtation began, one that Hitler, still reeling from the complex and tragic death of his half-niece Jelly Roble, would pursue. Its relationship would eventually evolve into one of the Reich's most closely guarded secrets. By facilitating this relationship, whether wittingly or not, Hoffmann became far more than the court photographer. He became the enabler, the confidant, the beard, and the original link to the woman who would become Hitler's long-term private companion. This intimate personal knowledge made him indispensable and privy to the true inner sanctum, a place no general or minister could access. His studio was not just where the public image was crafted, it was where the secret private life began, binding Hoffmann to Hitler with chains of secrecy, complicity, and personal gratitude that were stronger than any political mandate. At the Berghof, Hitler's mountain retreat in the Bavarian Alps, Hoffmann was far more than a photographer. He was a core member of the inner circle, the Berghof set, described by all who were there, including Albert Speer, as having dog-like loyalty. He was a court jester, a drinking buddy, and a close personal friend, capturing the regime's elite in their most candid, unguarded, and chillingly banal moments. While other figures in the circle, the ambitious Albert Speer, the scheming Joseph Goebbels, the powerful Martin Bormann, vied for political power and influence. Hoffmann's role was purely social. High in the mountains, far from the formalities and pressures of Berlin, Hitler curated a Hofstadt, or court of old comrades and loyalists, where he could relax. Hoffmann was prized for his jovial, unpretentious nature, his endless repertoire of Bavarian jokes, and his unique ability to diffuse Hitler's famously dark, brooding moods. He was the court jester, the only one who could, on occasion, gently rib the fur and make him laugh. He was the man for a good time, and all the while his Leica camera was present, a seemingly natural extension of his presence, but never intrusive. Because he was seen as family and not the press, his lens captured what no other could. The architects of genocide at ease. He photographed Goebbels laughing uproariously at a joke, Göring relaxing in outlandish custom-made outfits, Speer and Hitler poring over architectural models late into the night. These images of candid normalcy of men relaxing on a terrace, listening to records, watching movies, or playing with their children. All while the continent burned, are perhaps his most insidious propaganda. They were not for public consumption, but they served to humanize the monstrous for those within the circle, creating a bubble of camaraderie and reinforcing the collective illusion that these were just normal, hard-working men serving a common noble cause. Hitler, the famously failed artist who saw himself as the supreme cultural critic of Germany, appointed Hoffmann as his official arbiter of acceptable German art. He was given the immense power to select all works for the Great German Art Exhibition, and used this position to personally profit from the Nazi regime's systematic and brutal plunder of degenerate and Jewish-owned art. Hitler despised modernism, expressionism, cubism, Dada, abstract art, which he branded Entertiet, Kunst, or degenerate art, blaming it on a conspiracy of Jewish and Bolshevik cultural corruption. To replace it, he envisioned a new, pure German art, heroic, classical, realistic, and deeply sentimental kitsch. And who better to curate this middle-brow, populist vision than his loyal, unpretentious, and aesthetically conservative photographer? Hoffmann was given immense cultural power tasked with scouring Germany and personally selecting every single painting and sculpture for the regime's annual artistic centerpiece, the Grosse Deutsche Kunstausstellung, Great German Art Exhibition. This exhibition was held in the newly built Monumental House of German Art in Munich and ran concurrently with the infamous Degenerate Art Exhibition, which was staged nearby to mock and ridicule the works of modern masters like Picasso, Klee, and Chagall. Hoffmann's role was not just to select, it was to define what was acceptable. This official position also gave him an official pretext and a perfect cover to engage in the art world's dark underside. As he traveled the Reich, identifying good art, he was also perfectly placed to identify, catalog, and ultimately profit from the degenerate art that was being systematically purged from museums and private collections. Hoffmann's true, unrelenting, and primary engine was money. While he reveled in the access, the artist title, and the cultural power, his primary motivation was, and always had been, commercial. His loyalty was handsomely, strategically, and secretly rewarded. He struck an exclusive private deal directly with Hitler that gave him a personal royalty on every single image of the Führer used by the state, most notably on all postage stamps. This arrangement, effectively a tax on Hitler's face, made Hoffmann a multimillionaire, one of the wealthiest men in the Third Reich. The deal he engineered was a work of parasitic genius. He received a royalty for every official use of his Hitler portraits. This was not a one-time fee, but a continuous passive stream of income. The most lucrative part of this, by far, was the postage stamp. The Reichspost, the German post office, was a state entity. Every time a German citizen bought a stamp bearing Hitler's image to mail a letter, a small percentage of that Staatsgebühr state fee was secretly, automatically diverted from the state treasury directly into Heinrich Hoffmann's private bank account. This was a direct diversion of state funds to a private citizen, personally authorized by the Führer and bypassing all normal budgetary processes. Clear act of cronyism and corruption. When you multiply this tiny fee by the hundreds of millions of letters and packages sent across an expanding empire, year after year, the scale of the wealth becomes staggering. It was, as the outline notes, a tax on Hitler's face, levied by the state on its own people. For the exclusive benefit of one man, his greed went even deeper, into the darkest, most criminal realms of the regime's policies. Hoffmann actively and personally participated in the Aryanization of the art world, using his immense political connections and his official title as art arbiter to acquire art dealerships and priceless collections seized from Jewish owners at forced sale prices, profiting directly from racial persecution. Aryanization was the state's sanctioned, systematic, and brutal policy of forcing Jews out of the German economy, seizing their businesses and confiscating their property. Hoffmann, with his direct line to Hitler and Martin Bormann, was perfectly positioned to exploit this brutal system. Was not just a passive beneficiary, he was an active predator, used his official position to travel, identify, and inspect valuable art dealerships and prestigious private collections owned by Jewish families were desperate to flee the country. These families, facing the impossible, horrific choice of fleeing with nothing or being deported to a ghetto or camp, were coerced into selling their life's work, priceless masterpieces, old and new, at forced sale prices, which were a tiny, insulting fraction of their actual market value. Hoffmann would then swoop in, his purchase cloaked in the veneer of legality, legally acquiring these collections. He took over the prestigious Jewish-owned publishing house Bruckmann Verlag and Aryanized several important art galleries, including the Julius Baller Gallery in Munich. This was not just profiting from the regime's policies. It was direct, personal, and active participation in its crimes of extortion and persecution. A legalized theft cloaked in the cynical language of cultural purity. Despite his constant, intimate, and unparalleled access to the regime's inner circle, his presence at rallies, state dinners, private vacations, and even on the Eastern Front, Hoffmann's massive photographic archive is conspicuously, deafeningly silent on the regime's darkest crimes, the ghettos, the executions, and the camps. This is the moral black hole at the center of Hoffmann's work, the dog that didn't bark in the night. His archive is colossal, numbering over 500,000 negatives. He was everywhere. He was at the jubilant, torchlit Nuremberg rallies, capturing the hypnotic, terrifying spectacle of the masses. He was at the decadent dinners in the Reich Chancellery. He was at the signing of the Munich Agreement. He even traveled to the Eastern Front, well protected behind the lines, to photograph heroic soldiers advancing into the Soviet Union. He had unparalleled access, the complete trust of the leadership, and a camera perpetually around his neck. Yet what is not in this vast archive is as telling as what is. There are no images of the systematic humiliation of Jews on the streets of Berlin during Kristallnacht. There are no photographs of the forced deportations of families being dragged from their homes and packed onto trains. There are no pictures from inside the sealed Warsaw Ghetto, no documentation of the Einsatzgruppen mass executions in the ravines of Babi Yar. Certainly no images from Auschwitz, Treblinka, or Dachau. Escaping horrific absence is not an accident. It is a choice. It is the willful, deliberate averting of the lens, the ultimate proof that Hoffmann's job was never to document reality. His job was to curate it. He was complicit in the curation of the regime's public memory, both by what he showed and, far more damnably, by what he hid. Captured by the U.S. Army in 1945, Hoffmann was reportedly in a state of total associative shock when confronted with the first films from the liberated concentration camps. His downfall was swift, total, and complete, culminating in a final bitter break from the man he had idolized, served, and enriched himself upon. In May 1945, the 1,000-year Reich collapsed in on itself. Hoffmann was arrested by American soldiers in Munich. He was no longer the jovial court photographer, the wealthy art dealer, or the Führer's friend. He was just another high-value prisoner, Dog, a key personality target for interrogation by the art-looting investigation unit. The moment of reckoning, according to reports from this period, came when he, along with other captured Nazi officials, was forced to watch the first unedited newsreels from the liberation of Dachau, Buchenwald, and Bergen-Belsen. The footage, the skeletal hollow-eyed survivors, the bulldozers, pushing piles of emaciated corpses into mass graves, the gas ovens, the mountains of shoes, hair and eyeglasses was the unvarnished, unfiltered reality that his lens had so carefully and deliberately avoided for 12 years. His reported total shock is a complex, unanswerable question. Was it the genuine horror of a man who had been willfully blind, living in the protected Berghof bubble? Was it the self-serving, calculated shock of a brand manager seeing the true, horrific, and undeniable nature of the product he had so successfully sold? Or was it the cold, sudden terror of a man realizing what he was now inextricably associated with, and what he would be held accountable for? Whatever its source, his world was shattered. His dog-like loyalty evaporated, replaced in his subsequent memoirs by a bitter, self-serving condemnation of the man who had been his benefactor. At his Danification trial, Hoffmann deployed his final and most predictable defense. He argued he was merely an apolitical artist. The court disagreed, classifying him as a major offender and war profiteer, not primarily for his propaganda, but for his immense cynical financial gains. He was sentenced to prison and stripped of his entire ill-gotten fortune. Facing the post-war tribunal, Hoffmann attempted to retreat into the identity he had started with. I was just a photographer. He portrayed himself as a simple, apolitical craftsman, a man who just took pictures, a technician who was only concerned with light and shadow, not ideology. He argued that he was an artist, not a politician, and that his work was mere documentation, not propaganda. The denazification court, however, was not convinced. He saw through the threadbare facade of the apolitical artist, while his role as a key propagandist was noted. The court's sharpest and most profound condemnation was aimed directly at his wallet. It classified him not as a mere follower, middle gear, or beneficiary, but as a major offender Hauptschuldiger, the highest and most severe category of guilt. The primary justification was not his creation of the Führer myth, but his cynical and ruthless exploitation of his political connections for enormous financial gain. He was, in their eyes, a war profiteer. The court sentenced him to a 10-year prison term, which was later reduced in a move that was most devastating for Hoffmann. Ordered the confiscation and seizure of his entire fortune, the millions in royalties, the priceless art collection, the publishing house, the real estate. All of it. Hoffmann's legacy is a profound, almost poetic historical irony. His entire photographic archive, the work of a lifetime, was seized by the Allies and is now a priceless public domain resource. The very tools he meticulously crafted to build a cult of personality, and which he guarded so jealously with copyrights, are now the most vital and freely available evidence that historians use to understand and deconstruct that very myth. Hoffmann spent his life curating a lie, fabricating an image, and becoming fabulously wealthy by owning that image. His final unintended contribution to history was losing control of it. His entire archive, the 500,000 negatives, the private Berghoff albums, the secret contact sheets of the rehearsed poses, all of it was seized by the U.S. Army. After a long and complex legal battle with his heirs, the collection was eventually transferred to the Bavarian state, Staatsbibliothek, in the U.S. National Archives, where it was declared public domain, accessible to all. The ultimate firewall against a new cult of personality is the free and total access to the evidence. The very tools Hoffmann crafted to build the Hitler myth, the images of the human Hitler, the candid moments, the majestic poses are now the single most important, vital, and freely available resource that historians, documentarians, and educators use to this day to deconstruct that very myth piece by piece. His curated lie became, in the end, the world's unfiltered truth.